Hey folks, today we're going to build a carousel or slider, whichever you prefer. For simplicity, I'll refer to this as a carousel throughout this video, and we'll be using the WordPress Interactivity API to bring it to life. So the first step is to head over to wordpress.org and search for the Interactivity API Quick Start. This will guide you to the block editor handbook, where you'll find the necessary command to get started. While we won't strictly follow their naming convention, the key takeaway here is to use the Create Block Interactive template provided by the WordPress scripts library. So once you've found the command, copy it from the handbook. Next, fire up your code editor of choice. I'm using Visual Studio Code or VS Code for this demo, and make sure you're in the right directory. Now for this, I've set up a site with the 2025 theme. Navigate to the plugins folder and open it in your terminal, and confirm your working directory is correct. In this case, it will be in the plugins folder for your local site. Now, we'll be working with Node.js, so it's important to manage your Node versions effectively, especially if you handle legacy systems like I do. So I use Node Version Manager or NVM for this purpose. So check the current Node version by running nvm list. And for this project, I'm going to be using the latest stable version, which is Node version 22. And to switch to that, all I need to do is to run nvm use 22. So with everything set up, paste the command you just copied into your terminal, and then update the project name to something more relevant. Now for this, I'll change it to Demo Carousel. Now once you hit return and run the command, it'll take a few minutes to complete and set up. So I'll speed through this part, and when it's done, we'll move on to the next steps. Alrighty, so we've finished the initial setup. Now let's navigate to the plugin. Specifically, we need to cd into the directory of the plugin we've just created, named Demo Carousel. Now this step is essential because we need to start the build process from within our plugin. So this plugin is a simple setup that links the necessary build files to register a block in the WordPress block editor, in the back end essentially. Now the key files we'll focus on are located in the source folder, specifically the render.php file that handles the server-side rendering for the block, the view.js file that contains the JavaScript for managing interactivity on the front end. So namespace. The first thing I recommend is updating the namespace. By default, the script uses the create-block namespace, which can cause conflicts if multiple plugins use the same namespace. So this can essentially become problematic when dealing with the Interactivity API, as the namespaces are crucial for targeting specific interactive blocks. If you're developing multiple blocks, you want to avoid conflicts with others, so ensure your namespace is unique. For example, I'll replace the default create block namespace for something more specific to our business, like Square One software. Use a find and replace tool in your code editor, search for create-block in the plugin folder, replace all occurrences with your chosen namespace. Now the namespace appears in several key locations. One in block.json at the top of the file, another in view.js, used in the interactivity references, and in the render.php for the server-side rendering logic. Now, although this is a global search and replace, you don't need to worry about changing the references in the build folder, although this will do that. This will be regenerated when we run the build process with npm. So the Interactivity API allows us to add dynamic behavior to blocks using HTML directives, very much like you would with JavaScript by adding the data attribute. And the primary directive is data WP interactive. And this needs to match your namespace because this is what glues everything together. All of the interactivity will be applied to this parent div and all of its child elements. So let's break down some of these functions. So basically the WP interactivity state function requires a namespace, which is the namespace for your block, and it initializes the handling of the dynamic behavior for the interactive block. Now this state includes the default settings and parameters which can be updated based on the user's interaction with the block. So think of these as the settings for your block, and this is the state. And anything that is changed due to interactions is referred to as the derived state. And then we have the WP_interactive_data_WP_context function. And this allows you to pass data to the blocks as a JSON encoded object via PHP. The context can then safely be embedded in the HTML attributes for use as values or can be accessed directly in JavaScript. providing a flexible way to manage block-specific data. So the API provides several HTML directives for interactivity. WP-on is effectively an event listener for actions like click, key up, or scroll events. The WP-class dynamically changes CSS classes based on a state. WP-watch watches state changes and updates the UI accordingly. So let's take a look at the example code. So where we have a div with data WP class that's set the state is dark, this essentially will toggle the dark theme class on that element. And lower down we have a button with an action called toggle theme. So WP class dynamically applies the dark-theme class based on if isDark state is true or false. And the onClick triggers the toggle theme action when clicked. The render.php file sets up the server-side rendering for the block, and the view.js file manages interactivity and hooks into the directives. So let's activate the plugin using WP CLI, and to do that I need to do WP plugin activate demo carousel. And now we can add the block to a post and see it in action. So I'll add the block to a post in the WordPress block editor, save the post and view it on the front end. Now if we observe the behavior when we click to toggle the changes, notice that the class dark theme is toggled on and off, or true or false. And in the example, the WP interactive state is used to manage the isDark state, which toggles between true and false. And this toggle action is defined in the view.js file and updates the state accordingly. Now, if you want to take a deeper dive into the Interactivity API, I have created a video previously, and I'll leave that in the top right of this video. However, I would actively encourage you to read the documentation on the developer.wordpress.org website. If you search for Interactivity API reference, you'll get all the documentation you need. Now, before I forget, if you're enjoying this video and you find it helpful, I've got a quick favour to ask. Now, did you know that hitting the like button not only makes my day, it actually helps other people discover this video? It's like sending a high five to the YouTube algorithm. And if you want, why not share this video? You never know who else might find it useful. Now, if you did any one of those things, it really means the world to me, so thank you so much. Now let's dive back into it. Now we'll customize the block. We'll simplify the provided demo code and build the carousel from scratch. And because we're starting from scratch, we won't be needing any of the demo state or the unique ID. So I'm going to strip all of that out just so that we can keep things clean and focused. And we can remove the demo context setup we had before. Now the context is where we can pass data, but we're going to simplify this. Instead, we'll be passing a variable called context, which we'll set up as an array at the top of our render.php file. Now this approach is useful because it's called from the server, and this allows us to pull data dynamically, whether it's from WordPress, a database, or an API, and then pass it down to our component. While we'll cover setting up the context array shortly, for now just know that it's an array that we can populate as needed. Next, let's remove the demo actions tied to the buttons. Now we will set up some actions, but because we're starting from fresh, we'll just strip all this out for the moment and we'll come back to the buttons shortly. What we'll focus on for now is defining the HTML structure for our carousel. We'll begin by creating a reference for the carousel navigation. So let's call this carousel navigation, and this will be the wrapping div for our buttons. Now we're also going to remove the P tag because it's not going to be relevant to our design. Instead, we'll introduce some essential elements for our carousel. And here's the structure. So we're going to create a div and we're going to add a class called carousel wrapper, which will act as the outer container. And inside that, we'll add another div with a class called carousel container. And finally, within the carousel container, we'll include all of the individual carousel items. And this will house items, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And this will serve as the foundational structure for our custom carousel as we build it out step by step. Now that we've established the foundation, it's time to pass data into the context variable. But before diving into that, let's clean up the view.js file to ensure everything is streamlined for this demo. And for this setup, we're not going to be using any callbacks, which are essentially functions that we can use. And we're not going to be setting any state in the view.js file, so we can get rid of that. Instead, we'll be focusing solely on using actions, and these actions will be handlers for tasks like toggling elements on and off, and making inline changes to HTML. To keep things simple for now, we'll modify the actions by removing the ones provided by the demo functions and replacing it with a basic test function. But before we proceed any further, it's a good idea to save and test frequently to catch any potential issues early before they pile up. So save all the files and then go back to the front end, and currently we're still working with the demo provided by the npm package. Now to see our stripped back carousel structure we've built take effect, we need to start a build process and save everything back to the post, which will ultimately save things back to the database. So to do that, we need to go back to our terminal and ensure that we're in the correct plugin directory, and we'll run the npm start command. Now you'll find a variety of helpful commands in the package.json file, including a script to create a standalone plugin, running linters for JavaScript and CSS formatting, and you can even set up things for coding standards specifically for PHP. That will enable you to run PHP sniffers directly from the directory. However, for now we'll stick with the basics and what's been provided. So if we run the npm start command, this will initiate the development process. It will watch the source folder, process all the files, and then output everything into the build folder. So once this is running, we'll be ready to move on to the next step of this carousel. The next step is to add interactivity or interactions for moving backwards and forth when the user clicks one of the buttons. So to achieve this, add a directive attribute to the button element, using data WP on click for the click event and assigning it to an action. So first define the actions object, and using dot notation, trigger one of the actions from the view.js file. For this carousel, we'll trigger a function called moveBack. So ensure that the moveBack function exists in the view.js file, and in this case I only have one function and I'm going to replace that function with moveBack. And also confirm that the getContext function is imported from the interactivity scripts at the top of the file. Now if you're using the template from the npm package, this should already be included. So assign the getContext function to a constant variable and then use console.log to inspect the context variable when the button is clicked. And what the getContext function does is basically retrieve any data that's passed to the WP interactivity data WP context function that is held in the render.php file. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to define an array at the top of the render.php file, and this array will get converted to a JSON object and made available to the block and the view.js file. When I say block, I mean the render.php file. And after saving all the files, check that there are no errors in the build process through the terminal, and there shouldn't be in this case. Now if it is error-free, you can basically go back to the website, refresh the page, and you can see the carousel functioning, albeit without any styling. And clicking the back button will log the context in the console, and somewhere we should have a representation of foo and bar, which is the object we passed down through the render.php file. And also using the browser inspector, examine the main div element. You'll find the JSON array under the data WP context attribute, and this demonstrates how data is passed and integrated into the block using the Interactivity API. And we'll use this on the carousel by adding parameters like a counter or the current index to track the position within the carousel container. So these initial settings will include the total number of items and the number of items visible per view. For example, if there are 9 items and we only want to see 3 visible at any one time, this data will help us to calculate how to shift the items as the user interacts with the move back and forth buttons. But before we do that, we'll hard code the styling for our carousel using SCSS, which is part of the build process. First, we need to check that the build process is still running, and since I can see it is, we can start to use the style.scss file to make changes. And when we save these changes, the build process will update the compiled CSS file in the build folder. So open up the style.scs file from the source folder, and I'm going to move it across to see it alongside the render.php file. Now we don't need any of the demo example code from the package template, so I'm going to remove that. So the first style I need to create is the carousel wrapper. Now I'm not entirely sure of the specifics yet because I need to check it in the browser as I style this. But since this is SCSS, we can nest the styles to reflect the nested nature or the structure of the markup. So for the main wrapper or the carousel wrapper, we'll set the overflow property to hidden. And to ensure that the content spills outside of the page or the container, we'll also set the width to 100%. Next, I'll set the style for the carousel container, and this is a nested element, so I'll set the display property to flex, and that will use Flexbox, which will align everything horizontally, which allows me to manipulate the carousel items within the container. And within the container, we have the carousel items. And now we'll set the basic style for the carousel items. I'm going to set a background color of a light blue, and I'm also going to set the min height of, say, 300 pixels, and then save that and then check it in the front end. Now this is just the basic structure so that we can see what's happening. So check the build process for any errors, and there are no errors, so we can go back to the browser. So after refreshing the page, everything looks styled, but it isn't fully complete yet. Now let's set the width for the carousel items using Flexbox. So we need to set flex, and there are 3 key parameters for flex: grow, shrink, and basis, which is the actual width. Now I don't want the items to grow or shrink, so I'll go ahead and set those to 0. And then for the basis, let's just start with 100% and then change it to 50% to display 2 items side by side, just so that we can see what's going on. Now to fit 3 items in the view, we'll set the width to 33%, which is 1/3 of 100%. But to be more accurate, it's actually 33.333 recurring. So I'll add 33.333. Now bear in mind that this value needs to be dynamic, but for now we'll just hard code it. Then let's update the CSS file with these values. And then we can pop back to the front end to check to see if it's all working. And as we can see, the structure's starting to take place. Next, we'll center the content within the carousel items. To do this, we'll use justified content and set that to space around, and then align the items to the center. However, to actually make these styles work, we also need to set the display property of the carousel items to flex. Now everything is centered as expected. Now each carousel will have an index number starting from 0, because technically index numbers are 0 based, which means they start at 0 and then increment by 1. E.g. the first slide is 0, the second slide is 1, and so on and so on. And we'll use these index values to dynamically slide the carousel items later, and this will become clearer as we build this functionality. And finally, I'll add the updated styles to the SCSS file, save it, and ensure the build process is still running and there are no errors. So go back to the front end and then refresh the page. Now it looks like I've missed a style, so if anything isn't aligned correctly, we can adjust the SCSS file, recompile it, then go back to the front end, refresh it until it's perfect, and this completes the basic style for the carousel. The next step is to dynamically control the width and the positioning of the items using parameters passed down through the context. So now let's look at a visual representation of how this will work, using the maths and the calculations to set the positioning of everything. Now to work out the maths behind the slider, we can use something called the modulo operator, or the mod operator. The mod operator is represented by a percentage symbol and works by dividing one number by another and returning the remaining value of that division. So when working with the slider, there are a couple of constants we can define. First of all, the total items. And this is the total number of items in the slider, and the items per view. And this is the number of items visible at any one time. And we can use the mod operator to determine the next index of the slider as it cycles through, and here's how it works. So if we start with an initial current index, say 0, add the items per view, e.g. 3, to the current index, and then apply the mod operator against the total number of items. So for example, if we have a current index of 0, 0 plus 3 equals 3, therefore the mod operator would be 3 mod 9, which is equal to 3, since 3 divided by 9 is 0, but we're left with a remainder of 3. So then the next index becomes 3. And when triggered by the onClick event, we can update the current index from 0 to 3. And we can use the updated index to calculate an offset for the position of the slider. Specifically, we'll use the CSS transform property with the translate X value, which is the horizontal movement. So the first step is to calculate the percentage offset for each item. And to do that, we can divide 100 by the number of items per view. For example, 100 divided by 3 equals 33.33, and we can set that as a percentage. So each item takes up 33.33% of the slider's width. Then determine the total offset for each current index. So multiply the index by the percentage per item. So for an index of 3, it would be 3 times 3.33, which equals 100. And then we can apply that as a negative value for the translate X. So we'll use transform translate X minus 100%. to move the slider 100% of its width. So if the current index is updated to 3, the offset becomes minus 100%, shifting the slider horizontally by 1 view. And as the index progresses, similar calculations keep the slider moving smoothly. By combining this logic with an on-click event and the CSS transition, we can create a seamless sliding effect that loops through all of the items. So let's dive back to the code and apply this logic. So we're going to change the parameters of our context because the context variable is where we feed all of our data. Now the context can ultimately come from the database or an API. However, for now, we're just going to hard code this. And the first parameter is going to be the CSS transform property, which will be set to translate X. And this is the horizontal parameter. And we're going to set this to 0%. Additionally, I'm going to set the items per view parameter to 3. Now I want to dynamically apply the items per view to my CSS and replace the current hard-coded 33.33%. And we can achieve this by passing a style attribute to the parent div element. To do this, I'll set a style variable using PHP's sprintf function. The sprintf function formats a string by replacing placeholders with variable values. For example, the formatted string will include a placeholder for a number represented with %d. This will be replaced by the value set in the items per view. And this value will come from the context and must be passed as a variable. Next, we'll take this variable and pass it as a style attribute to the parent element. So to do this, we'll add the style attribute and assign it using standard PHP. We'll also make sure to escape the attribute for security. The style attribute will then reference the variable we created earlier. In CSS, we can use this variable by performing a calculation. For example, we can divide 100% by the variable value. So when using variables in CSS, you need to reference the attribute name or variable name that was set using the CSS function for var. In this case, it's items per view. Just make sure to properly close all the tags. I also realized that my navigation has the wrong class. This shouldn't be carousel wrapper, it should be carousel navigation. The navigation class should be separate. So what this setup does is takes a value 3, sets it as a variable called style, and passes it as an attribute to the parent div, and this allows the variable to be used in CSS. And if we want to change this value dynamically, for instance, through a block setting, we can easily set this value to 4, 5, or other number. For example, if I change the items per view to 5 in the context array, then I can go to the front end and refresh the page, and we'll see 5 items instead of 3. And when we inspect the element, we can verify that the calculation value is applied correctly. So this approach makes the setup flexible, as block settings can dynamically control the number of items displayed. For now, I'm going to reset the value back to 3. The next step is to grab the transform property and set it as the initial setting for the carousel. I want to apply this setting within the carousel container, so retaining the class of carousel container. Additionally, I'm going to pass another directive down to this element, and this directive is called data wp style, and it will allow us to pick up the variable from the context array. The style I want to define is the transform property, which will be set based on the context array value for transform. Once again, we can use the dot notation because this is the context data that's being passed down through the data wp context function. We can reference it by adding the keyword context using dot notation to access the specific transform value. And this value has been set to translate X 0%. So after saving the changes, go back to the front end and refresh the page. We should see 3 slides displayed, which we do. And if we inspect the carousel container, we can confirm that the style transform is correctly being set to translate X 0%. Now we can modify the hard-coded value to something like minus 100% to adjust the starting position of our slides. Now we can see the 4th slide because the other slides are outside of the container because we set that to overflow hidden. Now this behavior can be calculated dynamically. While we haven't set up the full calculations yet, we know how it works and we'll implement that shortly. Now I want to set additional parameters for the context array. First, I want to set the current index, which will be initially set to 0. This value will be updated on the click event, and we can use it to calculate the transformation in our view.js file. That we'll do shortly. Next, I want to add another parameter similar to the items per view. which will be the total number of items, which I'll define as items total. For now, I'll set this items total to 9. This parameter will help us perform calculations needed to manage the sliders functionality. After saving this, we can switch back to the view.js file and focus on the function move back. And whilst we're still logging the context, we can test this setup. If we save the changes, we can go back to the front end and ensure we're looking at the console. And by clicking the back button, we can check the console and can confirm that the context contains the values for current index, items total, and items per view. And I can see that I've made an error in the items total, so I'll just pop back to the code and add items, plural, and test again. So clicking the back button now shows everything working as expected. Perfect. So with this setup in place, we can start using the parameters to handle the necessary calculations. So next I'm going to set the constant value, and this will represent the total items. In fact, we'll call it items total for consistency, and this will be equal to the context value we set in the items total in the PHP array. And using dot notation, we can set that as context.itemsTotal. Then we're going to set the items per view as another constant. So we can duplicate the existing constant and simply copy and paste the value from the original array, as it's quicker that way. Now we can figure out our maths. The first calculation we need to do is to determine the current index, and this will be set dynamically on the click event. For example, we'll reset the current index in the context array, and this is where we'll add our numbers together along with using the modulo operator against another number. In this case it's 9. So we want to take the current index and add that to the items per view. And as this is a calculation, we need to wrap it in brackets since it involves maths. So the calculation will look like this: context.currentIndex equals current index plus items per view and a percentage for the modulo against another value 9, and the value 9 here corresponds with our other constant value for the items total. So next we need to set the offset. Ideally this needs to be a negative value, so prepend it with a minus symbol. At this point, for example, if the current index is 0 and you add items per view, which is 3, the result will be 0 plus 3. So the offset will be a negative value, specifically it will be minus 3. Now we need to multiply this value. For the next calculation, we'll wrap it in parentheses. This involves dividing 100 by the items per view. So reuse the constant items per view here, and if items per view is 3, then 100 divided by 3 will equal 33.3. Now since the offset is set to minus 3, the calculation will be minus 100. Next, we'll set the transform value from the context. This will apply the translate x property using the offset value. Here's how we do it. Set the context.transform to change the current string value. Since this is a string, we need to use backticks. Inside the string, we'll include translate x and just include the parentheses with the value of 0%. Now to include a variable in JavaScript strings, we add the dollar symbol followed by curly braces. And inside the curly braces, we'll put the constant offset. So in the end, context.transform will be set as translate x minus 100%. To confirm this is all working, we'll log the transform value. To save the file, then make sure there are no errors in your build process, and if everything is fine, we can test it in the front end. So refresh the page, and in the console we should see minus 100. So just double check, refresh the page. Now we've got slides 1, 2 and 3, and if we hit the back button, you'll see slides 4, 5, 6, and click again, it should take you to slides 7, 8, 9. So everything's working as expected because the calculations are in place. The next thing we need to do is to work on the other button, which moves in the opposite direction. Essentially, this is just reverse engineering the existing calculation. We'll add another action called move forward after the move back function. And since this is a function, we'll include the parentheses and wrap it in curly braces. Now I've realized that my terminology might be in reverse, like moving back, moving forward, but hopefully you'll get the gist of what I'm trying to achieve. So in this function, first of all, we need to get the context and set up the action also on the button in the markup. So we'll add a new directive, data wp on click, and this will be equal to the new action. So it will be actions.move forward. And to ensure everything is working as expected, we'll console log the context. Now if we save the file and if we go back to the browser, refresh the page and test the buttons by clicking back and forth, should now show that we are logging data and the context is updating correctly. For example, the current index updates as expected. If the current index was set to 0, it's now set to 3. So everything seems fine. Now to reverse this functionality, we'll extract all of the variables again. Ideally, we'd avoid repeating this code, but for demonstration purposes, this approach is absolutely fine. Now the only difference in the reverse direction is the calculation. So instead of adding the current index to the items per view, we subtract it. Here's what happens step by step. So we take the current index and subtract the items per view. For example, if the current index is 3 and the items per view is 3, the result will be 0. 3 minus 3 is 0. Then we add the result to the total items to ensure proper wrapping. For instance, if the current index was 3 and the items per view is 3 and the total items is 9, we get 3 minus 3, which is 0, plus 9, which is 9. And then using the modulo operator, 9 into 9 goes once with the remainder of 0. Therefore, if the current index was 3, by clicking the button, we would return to 0. And with this calculation in place, clicking the other button works exactly as expected, going back, forwards by the items per view, in this case 3 at a time. And the calculation for the offset is exactly the same, so we can simply copy the code and paste it in to this function. Since the current index changes accordingly, the logic remains consistent even though it's in reverse. So once that's done, we can save the file and it should work as expected. Then go to the front end and test it out. So go back to the browser, refresh the page and test the buttons. When we click back, the transform moves by minus 100% and then 200%, and when we click forward, it progresses correctly through the index. Now all we need to do is to add a transition effect to smooth out the sliding animation, and since the effect is applied to the carousel container, all we need to do is add a transition property to it. So we'll use transition all over 1 second and we'll set the easing to ease in and out. And this will add a nice easing effect as the carousel slides. Now if you test it, you'll see that the slides transition smoothly. However, 1 second feels a bit too long, so I'll just reduce this to 0.5 seconds instead. Now with that adjustment, the sliding effect looks much better, it's smoother and more responsive. All that's left to do is to add the transition to the CSS. And I'll update the SCSS file targeting the class carousel container with the transition. And once saved, the transition is in place. Now I'll set up a Git repo for this and I'll leave a link in the description below. And that's it, that's how you set up a basic, simple carousel slider. Now as a bonus, we can even pull all of these parameters from the block attributes and settings in the back end. And in the next video, I'll show you exactly how to do that. We'll create settings in the block editor so you can customize all of these parameters directly from the admin. For now, if you've enjoyed this video, please smash the like button, and if you have any questions, do leave them in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.